301 AH-1 Cobras went down in Vietnam, shot out of the sky, blown apart on the ground, crashed into triple canopy, burned on landing zones. The Army lost them at a rate that would have killed any other program. One Cobra destroyed or damaged beyond repair every 4 days during the peak years of 1969 to 1971. And the helicopter that absorbed those losses, that bled crews at a pace the Pentagon tried very hard not to publicize, is still flying combat missions in 2026. The Marine Corps' and AH-1 Viper, the great-grandchild of the aircraft the Army almost canceled before it ever reached Saigon, carries Hellfire missiles, a target sight suite worth more than the entire original Cobra program's development budget, and a unit cost north of $30 million. The Bell Model 209 prototype that started all of this was built in 6 months on $1.5 million of company money in a facility that didn't even have a proper wind tunnel. 6 decades separate those two facts. The airframe connecting them was supposed to be a stopgap, a quick fix, something to hold the line until a real attack helicopter showed up. The real attack helicopter, the Lockheed AH-56 Cheyenne, got canceled in 1972 after burning through $400 million and killing 2 test pilots. Its replacement, the Hughes YAH-64, didn't become the AH-64A Apache until 1984. The Cobra was supposed to fill a 2-year gap. It filled 17. And then it just kept going. The critics had a point, at least on paper. The AH-1G that first arrived in country with the 334th Armed Helicopter Company in September 1967 had an aluminum skin you could puncture with a screwdriver. The transmission housing would stop a 7.62 millimeter round, sometimes. But the tail boom was essentially a soda can with a drive shaft running through it. A single-point .51 caliber hit to the tail rotor gearbox was a death sentence. The fuel cells were self-sealing, which sounds reassuring until you learn that self-sealing meant they'd stop leaking after a 7.62 millimeter puncture, but would rupture catastrophically from anything bigger. Cockpit armor consisted of ceramic composite panels that protected the crew from small arms fired below and to the sides, but left the top, rear, and a surprising amount of the front completely exposed. Warrant Officer Larry Brown, who flew Cobras with the 4th Battalion, 77th Aerial Rocket Artillery, told author Matthew Brennan for the book Headhunters, "We used to say the armor would protect you from anything that wasn't actually going to hit you." The helicopter weighed 6,073 pounds empty and carried 2 crew members stacked in tandem in a fuselage 36 inches wide. 36 inches. A dishwasher is wider than that. Every pound of armor Bell's engineers added to the prototype came directly out of weapons payload or fuel capacity, and the Army wanted weapons and fuel more than it wanted protection. So the crews flew with what they had, and what they had was thin. But here is where the math stops making sense if the Cobra was truly the death trap its detractors claimed. Of those 301 Cobras lost in Vietnam, a figure compiled from Army aviation loss records and cross-referenced in the Center for Army Lessons Learned database, the crew fatality rate was significantly lower than the UH-1 Hueys, aircraft for aircraft, mission for mission. The Cobra flew deliberate attack profiles into prepared defenses. It rolled in on .51 caliber positions and 37 millimeter anti-aircraft guns into concentrations of automatic weapons that would have shredded a Huey in seconds. It did this daily for 6 years, and its crews survived at rates that surprised everyone, including Bell's own engineers. The narrow frontal profile, that same 36-inch fuselage the critics mocked, presented enemy gunners with a target roughly 1/3 the width of a Huey. At 500 meters, a head-on Cobra was almost impossible to track with iron sights. The aircraft's speed in a diving attack run, 190 knots with a clean wing, meant it crossed a typical engagement zone in under 4 seconds. A crew chief on a Huey could see individual tracer rounds floating up toward the windscreen. A Cobra pilot in a gun run saw a blur. Bell's engineers understood they'd never armor the Cobra well enough to survive heavy ground fire. So, they designed it to avoid getting hit. narrow profile, high speed, minimal time in the engagement zone, and when rounds did connect, to keep flying long enough to get home. That distinction has been misunderstood for decades, buried under the assumption that the Cobra survived Vietnam despite its design rather than because of it. An aircraft the Army treated as disposable became the longest-serving attack helicopter in American history, and the reason is right there in that 36-inch fuselage. The smell inside Bell's Hurst, Texas plant in the summer of 1965 was aluminum shavings and hydraulic fluid, cut with the sour tang of fresh epoxy. 16 engineers worked in a space not much bigger than a residential garage, pulling transmission assemblies and rotor components off the UH-1C production line after hours, bolting them onto a fuselage that existed only in pencil sketches 8 months earlier. The Pentagon hadn't asked for this helicopter and wasn't paying for it. Bell was spending $1.5 million of its own capital, roughly $14 million in today's dollars, on an aircraft the Army had explicitly said it did not want, because the Army already had its dream gunship on order from Lockheed. The Cheyenne, the AH-56A. If you've never heard of it, that's because it became one of the most expensive failures in American rotorcraft history. But in 1965, it was the future of Army aviation. Lockheed's design was radical in ways no production helicopter had attempted. A compound helicopter with a rigid rotor, a pusher propeller on the tail, stub wings for additional lift, and a belly turret that could rotate 360 degrees. It would cruise at 220 knots, carry tow missiles, and operate at standoff ranges that made the whole concept of a diving gun run obsolete. The Army awarded Lockheed a development contract worth $88.9 million in March 1966 for 10 prototypes. On paper, the Cheyenne made every other attack helicopter concept look like a biplane. Bell's chief engineer, Charlie Seibel, had seen the classified briefings. He knew what Lockheed was proposing, and he'd figured out two things the Army's procurement officers apparently hadn't. Compound helicopters had a nasty habit of killing test pilots, and Lockheed had never built a single production helicopter. So, Seibel made a bet. Rather than compete with the Cheyenne on performance, which was impossible given Bell's budget of essentially zero government dollars, he would compete on time. The Army needed gunship capability in Vietnam immediately. The UH-1B and UH-1C gunships were taking catastrophic losses in the Ia Drang Valley and the Central Highlands. Door gunners on transport Hueys were burning through barrel after barrel trying to suppress landing zones that bristled with automatic weapons. The Army didn't need a helicopter that could do everything in 1972, it needed one that could shoot back in 1967. Bell's Model 209 prototype used the engine, transmission, and rotor system from the UH-1C components already in mass production, already supported by the Army's logistics chain, already understood by every mechanic in Vietnam. Seibel's team wrapped those proven components in a new fuselage that was, and I think this remains one of the cleverest moves in American aviation history, deliberately minimalist. 2 crew in tandem under a narrow canopy, stub wings for ordnance, a chin turret with a minigun or grenade launcher. The prototype's first flight came on September 7, 1965, at Bell's Arlington, Texas facility, just 188 days after the program started. Bart Kelly, Bell's vice president of engineering, later told the American Helicopter Society that the 209 flew before we finished the paperwork to say it existed. The speed of that development cycle is almost incomprehensible by modern standards. The V-22 Osprey took 25 years from requirement to initial operational capability. Bell built the Cobra prototype in less time than it takes to process a Pentagon parking permit. The Army's initial reaction was lukewarm at best. General Hamilton Howze, who had chaired the famous Howze Board in 1962, recommending massive expansion of Army aviation, saw the Model 209 demonstration at Fort Benning and reportedly called it a Huey in a party dress. The Cheyenne was still the institutional favorite, but the Cheyenne wasn't flying. Wouldn't fly until September 1967, and American soldiers were dying in helicopter assaults every week. The pressure came from the field, not from the procurement offices. Commanders in Vietnam sent after-action reports describing UH-1C gunships absorbing 30, 40, 50 hits per mission. The 7.62mm miniguns on the Huey gunships couldn't suppress prepared positions fast enough to protect the troop carriers behind them. Something purpose-built had to fill that gap, and the only purpose-built option that actually existed was sitting in Bell's hangar in Texas. The Army ordered 110 AH-1 Cobras in April 1966. The contract came with a delivery timeline that would have been aggressive for an automobile manufacturer. First production aircraft within 12 months. Bell hit the deadline. The first AH-1Gs rolled off the Hearst production line in June 1967, and by September, they were in Vietnam. Meanwhile, the Cheyenne prototype had just completed its maiden flight and was already showing the rotor instability problems that would plague the program for the next 5 years. Lockheed's test pilot David Beale died on March 12, 1969, when the third prototype's rigid rotor struck the fuselage during a high-speed run. The program staggered on until August 1972, when the Army finally pulled the plug. By that point, Bell had delivered over 1,100 Cobras. The interim solution had outlasted the program it was supposed to bridge to. At 0640 hours on October 9, 1967, two AH-1Gs from the 334th Armed Helicopter Company, call sign Playboys, lifted off from Lane Army Heliport near Quinon, loaded with 2.75-inch rockets and 7.62mm minigun ammunition. Their mission was escort 4 UH-1D slicks carrying a platoon from the 1st Cavalry Division into a landing zone in the Saigon Valley, a stretch of scrubby highland terrain that intelligence rated as low threat. The LZ was cold. No prep fires had been requested. The flight lead, Captain Robert Gentry, later described the pre-mission brief to aviation historian John Gilmartin as about as routine as it gets. We were bored before we cranked. By 0658, both Cobras had taken ground fire from positions that didn't appear on any intelligence overlay. One pilot was bleeding from plexiglass fragments embedded in his neck, and the 334th had logged the Cobra's first confirmed kills in combat. What happened in those 18 minutes became a template that would repeat itself across thousands of engagements over the next 6 years. The slicks descended toward the LZ in trail formation, and at 200 feet the tree line erupted. Muzzle flashes from at least 4 positions. The distinctive, heavy thudding of a .51 caliber machine gun mixed with the sharper crack of AK-47 fire. The lead slick took rounds through the cargo floor and banked hard right, aborting the approach. Standard procedure for UH-1C gunships would have been to orbit wide, roll in from altitude, and make a beam attack perpendicular to the tree line, exposing the full broadside of the helicopter to enemy fire for 8 to 10 seconds during each pass. The Cobras did something different. Gentry rolled in nose first, straight at the .51 caliber position, the aircraft's 36-inch profile slicing head-on into the stream of tracers. His front seater opened up with the M134 minigun at 1,500 meters, well outside the effective aimed range of the DSHK heavy machine gun, and walked 4,000 rounds per minute into the tree line, while Gentry pickled pairs of rockets into the muzzle flashes. The .51 caliber went silent after the second pass. Both Cobras had taken hits. Gentry's aircraft had 7 7.62mm holes in the tail boom and a shattered chin bubble. The fragment wound to his front seater's neck, the only crew injury. The second Cobra took a single round through the stub wing that nicked a hydraulic line, leaving a thin mist of red fluid trailing behind the aircraft for the flight home. Neither helicopter went down. The slicks completed the insertion on the second approach, the platoon reporting 4 enemy dead in the tree line positions, along with the destroyed DSHK. 7 hits to the tail boom, and the aircraft kept flying. That detail circulated through Army aviation channels faster than any official report. Maintenance crews at Lane photographed the damage and passed the prints around. The aluminum skin was punctured clean through in every case, entrance and exit holes, and you could stick a pencil through. But the rounds had passed through empty space between the outer skin and the tail rotor drive shaft without hitting anything critical. Bell's engineers hadn't armored the tail boom because they couldn't afford the weight. What they'd done instead, almost by accident, was create a structure with so little internal density that small arms rounds passed through it the way a bullet passes through a paper bag. The aircraft bled a little hydraulic fluid. A crew chief patched the holes with speed tape and sheet aluminum in under 2 hours. The vulnerability was real. A single well-placed round to the drive shaft. The tail rotor gearbox, the push-pull tube running to the tail rotor pitch change mechanism, or any of the control cables bundled alongside it would have been catastrophic. The 334th would learn that soon enough. But the aircraft's first day of shooting had demonstrated something the spec sheets and the critics hadn't accounted for. Most of the bullets that hit a Cobra didn't hit anything that mattered. The sound that defined Cobra tactics wasn't the minigun or the rocket motor. It was the low, guttural whopping of rotor blades in a hard brake turn. The disc loaded up to its structural limit. The airframe shuddering at 3.5 Gs, every rivet in the tail boom singing, the pilot's chicken plate digging into his collarbones as he hauled the cyclic into his lap and stood on the left pedal. That maneuver, the brake turn into the threat, became the foundational move of attack helicopter warfare. Nothing in the manuals described it before 1968, and no simulator taught it. Crews figured it out the same way infantrymen have always figured out what works. The ones who tried something else died. The Army had no attack helicopter doctrine when the Cobra arrived in Vietnam. 0. The field manuals covering armed helicopter operations, FM 1-110, published in 1966, were written entirely around the UH-1C gunship, an aircraft that shared the Cobra's engine, but almost nothing else about its flight envelope. UH-1C tactics emphasized lateral passes and orbit patterns that kept the gunship broadside to the target, because the Huey's door-mounted weapons could only fire to the sides. The Cobra's weapons pointed forward. Its chin turret traversed, but the rockets and the minigun were bore-sighted along the aircraft's longitudinal axis. Everything about the way armed helicopters had fought for the previous 4 years was suddenly irrelevant. Captain George Gritch, who commanded a Cobra platoon in the 235th Armed Helicopter Company, told the Army Aviation Association of America in a 1985 retrospective that the first weeks were pure improvisation. We were making it up between refueling stops, and half of what we tried almost killed us before the enemy got the chance. What emerged from that improvisation was the fire team concept. 2 Cobras working as a pair, one rolling in while the other covered from altitude, then swapping roles in a continuous rotation that kept at least one aircraft's weapons on target at all times. The geometry was simple. The lead aircraft, Gun 1, would roll in on a heading roughly 30 degrees offset from the target axis, fire its ordnance, then brake hard away from the threat while the wingman, Gun 2, rolled in from the opposite side. Viewed from above, the pattern traced a figure 8 with the target at the center. Crews called it the daisy chain, though the official terminology that eventually made it into FM 1-100 was fire team engagement pattern. The daisy chain solved 2 problems simultaneously. It kept continuous fire on the enemy position, denying them the 5 to 8 second recovery window that UH-1C orbit patterns had allowed, and it meant that ground gunners tracking one Cobra were presenting their flank to the other. Shooting at Gun 1 meant ignoring Gun 2, and Gun 2 was already in its run. The pattern wasn't foolproof. It required both aircraft to maintain precise altitude separation, typically Gun 1 at 800 feet AGL on the run, and Gun 2 holding at 1,500 feet. And it demanded the kind of crew coordination that only came with repetition. Early fire teams frequently lost sight of each other during breaks, or rolled in simultaneously from converging headings, creating mid-air collision risks that were, for a brief, ugly period in late 1967 and early 1968, statistically more dangerous than enemy fire. The 334th lost a Cobra in November 1967, not to ground fire, but to a near miss with its own wingman that forced an evasive maneuver into the trees. The records list it as an operational loss. Crews knew what it actually was, a doctrine problem that hadn't been solved yet. By mid-1968, the fire team pattern had been refined through hundreds of engagements into something approaching standardization, passed from experienced crews to replacements through in-country training that bore no resemblance to anything taught at Fort Rucker. The schoolhouse eventually caught up. FM 1-100, revised in 1971, codified tactics that Cobra crews had been flying for 3 years. The Apache community inherited those patterns wholesale when the AH-64 entered service in 1986. They still fly them. Redstone Arsenal, Alabama, autumn 1972. A flat stretch of packed red clay designated Range 67, heat shimmering off the ground even in October. The air tasting of dust and propellant residue. Parked 3,000 meters downrange sat a decommissioned M48 Patton tank. Its turret traversed to present the thickest part of its frontal armor to the firing line. The shooter wasn't on the ground. An AH-1G hovered at 150 feet. Nose slightly depressed, a single BGM-71 Tau missile hanging from the left inboard pylon on a launcher that Bell's engineers had welded together in 6 weeks using parts from 3 different programs. The front seater, a civilian test pilot named Jim Gruenhagen, centered his optical sight on the M48's turret ring, squeezed the trigger, and watched 3.6 seconds of controlled flight end in a white flash that blew the turret clean off its race. The shaped charge warhead, 5.3 pounds of Composition B behind a copper liner, had punched through 430 millimeters of rolled, homogeneous steel equivalent. No tank in the Soviet inventory short of the T-64 could survive that hit from the front. Nothing in the inventory could survive it from the side or rear. This single demonstration changed the trajectory of Cold War land warfare planning more than any weapons test since the first Tau ground launch in 1970. The Soviets understood the implications immediately. A helicopter that cost $280,000 could kill a tank that cost $750,000 from a range where the tank couldn't shoot back. The math was brutal. A company of Cobras, 8 aircraft carrying 8 tow missiles each, could theoretically destroy 64 tanks in a single sortie. The entire group of Soviet forces Germany fielded roughly 7,000 tanks. You didn't need to be a strategist to see where those numbers led. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff, told a closed session of the Warsaw Pact Military Council in 1982, the transcript was declassified after German reunification, that American attack helicopters armed with precision anti-tank missiles represented the most significant shift in the ground combat balance since the introduction of the tank itself. Ogarkov was responsible for planning a potential Soviet offensive into Western Europe. He wasn't exaggerating, he was describing what kept him up at night. The AH-1Q, the first production tow-capable Cobra variant, entered service in 1975 with 8 missile tubes on the stub wings and a telescopic sight unit mounted above the nose. The system was crude by later standards. The gunner had to keep the crosshairs on the target for the entire missile flight time, while the aircraft held a steady hover, making it vulnerable to return fire for up to 20 agonizing seconds at maximum range. Crews called the hover sitting in the phone booth. But the weapon worked, and its combat debut validated everything Redstone had promised. During the Iran-Iraq War, Iranian AH-1 Cobras, the twin-engine variant sold to the Shah's military before the 1979 revolution, engaged Iraqi T-62 and T-55 tanks in the Khuzestan province battles of 1980 and 1981. Iranian Army aviation records, partially published by researcher Tom Cooper in his 2003 study of the air war, document at least 100 confirmed tank kills by tow-armed Cobras in the first 18 months of the conflict. Iraqi armored columns advancing toward Dezful and Avaz ran into Cobra fire teams operating from palm groves and irrigation berms, popping up to fire, guiding the missile to impact, then dropping below the tree line before the tank crews could identify the launch point. The Iraqis lost an entire armored brigade's worth of equipment in the November 1981 fighting around Boston. Cooper's research, drawn from captured Iraqi after-action reports, describes tank commanders refusing to advance without dedicated anti-aircraft escorts, a complete inversion of the traditional armor-infantry relationship. Critics had dismissed the Cobra as too fragile for the modern battlefield. It was now dictating the movement of 40-ton main battle tanks. The Cheyenne, had it ever worked, was supposed to do exactly this. The Cobra did it first. How long can a 1960s airframe stay relevant? The Marine Corps answered that question across 4 wars in 15 years, and the answer kept surprising people who should have known better. The AH-1W Super Cobra that crossed the Saudi-Kuwaiti border on February 24, 1991, shared its basic silhouette with the aircraft that flew over the Saigon Valley in 1967, but almost nothing else. Twin General Electric T7, 00-401. Engines producing 3,380 shaft horsepower, more than double the original AH-1G's single Lycoming T-53. A night targeting system mounted in a turret above the nose. Hellfire missiles on the outboard pylons, TOW on the inboard, a 3-barrel M19720 mm cannon under the chin that could put a round through a car door at 1,500 meters. The Marines had spent 2 decades and roughly $1.2 billion turning Bell's interim gunship into something its designers would barely recognize. During the 100-hour ground war, Marine Light Attack, Helicopter Squadron 369, the gunfighters, flew 86 combat sorties and engaged Iraqi armor, artillery positions, bunker complexes, and troop concentrations across the Kuwaiti theater of operations. HMLA 369's after-action report documents 28 vehicles destroyed, including 5 T-55 tanks, with 0 aircraft lost to enemy fire. The Super Cobras took hits. Several came back with holes in them. The 36-inch fuselage was still doing its job, 24 years after Gentry's first engagement. 12 years later, different desert, different war. On March 23, 2003, during the push toward Baghdad, a flight of 4 AH-1Ws from HMLA 267 flew into a wall of ground fire near Nasiriyah that would have made a Vietnam-era Cobra pilot feel right at home, except the volume was worse. RPGs, heavy machine guns, small arms from rooftops and alleyways, the oily black smoke from burning vehicles mixing with the tan haze of a minor sandstorm to cut visibility below half a mile. The smell of cordite and JP5 exhaust filled the cockpits through the environmental system intakes. Captain Eric Garcia, flying lead, took an RPG fragment through his canopy that shattered the instrument panel and peppered his flight gloves with shrapnel. He continued the mission for another 40 minutes, providing cover for a Marine convoy that had been ambushed on what would become known as Ambush Alley. Garcia received the Distinguished Flying Cross. His aircraft went back to the maintenance tent and got patched. It flew again the next day. The Nasiriyah engagements may be the closest thing the Cobra has to a definitive combat record. The Army's AH-64 Apaches had been mauled the night before during a deep attack against the Medina Division near Karbala. 31 aircraft hit, 1 shot down, none achieving their primary objectives. The Apaches were flying at extended range against prepared defenses, a mission profile that exposed their considerable sophistication to the oldest weapon in the enemy's arsenal, massed small arms fire from fighters who didn't care about dying. The Marines' Cobras were doing what Cobras had always done, flying low and close, staying with the grunts. Major William Liebach, HMLA 267's operations officer, told Marine Corps Gazette in a July 2003 article that the Cobra's survivability came down to something counterintuitive. "We don't have the systems that make you think you can stand off and fight clean. We get in the dirt with the infantry because that's all we've ever known how to do." Afghanistan added altitude to the equation. Super Cobras operating out of Camp Bastion in Helmand Province regularly flew at density altitudes exceeding 8,000 feet. The twin engines straining in thin air. Weapons loads cut by a third to maintain hover capability. Marine Cobras flew over 30,000 combat hours in Afghanistan between 2008 and 2012, providing close air support in terrain that ranged from irrigated river valleys to bare rock mountainsides where the rotor wash kicked up clouds of talcum-fine dust that scoured plexiglass opaque in weeks. By then, the airframe was 40 years old. Missions kept coming anyway. The targeting site housing on the AH-1Z Viper's nose turret is 14 inches in diameter. Inside that housing sits a Lockheed Martin AN/AAQ-30 target sight system. Infrared, electro-optical, laser designator, laser rangefinder, capable of identifying a human-sized target at 25 kilometers and tracking it through dust, smoke, rain, and darkness simultaneously. The sensor package alone costs more than the entire AH-1G did in 1967. Bell delivered the first production AH-1Z to Marine Helicopter Squadron 1 at Marine Corps Air Station, New River, North Carolina, in September 2010, and the aircraft that rolled off the line looked like the Cobra the way a Formula One car looks like a Model T. Same basic idea, completely different machine. The Z model kept the tandem cockpit, kept the stub wings, kept the chin turret, kept the narrow fuselage, though that fuselage had been widened to 38 inches, a concession to modern avionics and crew comfort that the original designers would have found luxurious. Everything else was new. Twin General Electric T700-GE-401C engines, producing 3,600 shaft horsepower, driving a 4-blade composite rotor system that replaced the 2-blade teetering rotor the Cobra had used since 1965. That rotor change mattered more than any other single upgrade. The 4-blade system reduced vibration by 70%, increased maximum speed to 222 knots, improved hover ceiling by over 3,000 feet, and gave the Viper an agility envelope that test pilots described as closer to the Apache longbow than to any previous Cobra variant. The composite blades could take 23mm cannon hits and keep flying. I think the 4-blade rotor is the single most important modification in the Cobra's entire 60-year lineage, and it's barely discussed outside specialist publications. What the Marines got for their $31 million per copy was an attack helicopter that could do things the Super Cobra couldn't dream of. The AN/APG-78 longbow radar, originally developed for the AH-64D, was integrated as an option, giving the Viper the ability to detect and classify 128 targets simultaneously in a single radar sweep. Hellfire 2 missiles on the wings. AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles for the self-defense role that nobody talks about but every Cobra pilot trains for. A helmet-mounted display system that slaved the nose turret to the pilot's head movements, putting weapons on target wherever the crew looked. Advanced precision kill. Weapon system rockets, essentially laser-guided 2.75-inch rockets with a CEP under 1 meter, that turned the Cobra's oldest weapon into a precision munition. The APKWS was a particular point of pride for the community. A single rocket that cost $28,000 could do the work of a Hellfire that cost $150,000, and the Viper carried more of them. Lieutenant General Robert Schmidl, then Deputy Commandant for Aviation, told the Senate Armed Services Committee in March 2012 that the AH-1Z represented the most cost-effective attack helicopter capability in the Department of Defense inventory. He was making a budget argument, plain and simple. The Viper cost roughly 40% less per flight hour to operate than the AH-64A Apache Guardian, $4,190 versus approximately $7,200, while carrying comparable weapons, loads in the close air support mission that consumed 90% of actual combat sorties. The Marines had always been the cheapest date in the Pentagon. The Viper continued that tradition with an aircraft that matched the Apache in the missions Marines actually flew. By 2025, the Marine Corps had taken delivery of 189 AH-1Z Vipers. They deployed to the Western Pacific aboard amphibious assault ships, operating from flight decks in salt spray conditions that would corrode a land-based airframe in months. The Viper's marinized systems, sealed avionics bays, corrosion-resistant coatings on every exterior surface, folding rotor blades and stub wings for shipboard storage, made it the only American attack helicopter that could operate from a ship without a dedicated maintenance facility ashore. The Army's Apaches couldn't do that, couldn't even attempt it. In the Pacific theater that the Pentagon's strategic planners kept insisting was the future of American military operations, that capability gap mattered. 301 Cobras went down in Vietnam. The critics had their number: thin-skinned, too narrow, too fragile, an interim solution that would be replaced by something better within 2 years. The Cheyenne was canceled. The Comanche followed it into oblivion after burning through $6.9 billion. And the Cobra kept flying. The AH-1Z Viper is currently scheduled to remain in Marine Corps service until 2044, which would make the Cobra lineage 77 years old at retirement. Bell's 16 engineers in that Hurst, Texas garage built their prototype in 8 months on a shoestring budget with borrowed parts. The fuselage they designed, the one every general called a death trap, is still 38 inches wide, still taking hits, still flying the next day.